let's look at a more complex example of default function arguments. So it's simple enough to show you an example where an argument is defaulted to a number or an empty object, but there are definitely more complex use cases of default parameters as well. Let's imagine for a moment that we are working on a web application and we need to make a function that will create a user object. So like a function that will create a user. So first I'm going to create that user object as a function. So we'll make our user. And we'll say that whenever a user is created, they must be created with an ID. So we'll assign the ID to this.id. Okay, so now I could do something like new user with an ID of 1, and that would give me a user with ID 1. Okay, so let's now say that maybe whenever we create a user, we don't want to have we want to generate randomly an ID. We want like a random ID to be generated. So we're not going to just use like 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to have a fully random number to make sure that we don't collide with any existing user IDs that we've already generated. So to do that, we might make a separate function called something like generate ID. And the purpose of generate ID will be just to generate a random token to use as the ID. So we'll do math.random times like 99999. And this would give me presumably some maybe reasonably unique or random number that would not collide with any existing users I have. All right, so now we've got our stuff in here. We've got the ability to create a user with an ID, and we can create a random ID. So I'm going to add in one last step here, and I'm going to say that we want to imagine that we want to have the concept of an admin user, which will take an argument of a user and promote it into a user, or excuse me, into an admin. So I want a function that will take a user and promote them into an admin. Okay, that's the goal here. So maybe I've got an argument of a user, and I'll say that the admin is a user by just changing this flag to true, and then I can return the user. All right, so one thing that I want you to notice here about this current setup is that I'm kind of implicitly saying that whenever you want to create an admin user, you must first create a user and then call create admin user with it. So in other words, to make all this code right here work, you're always going to have to do something like create admin user, new user, and inside of that call generate ID. So we've got this kind of real ugly nested call right here. So this would be a fantastic use case of default function arguments. In practice, if I want to create an admin user like from scratch, like just make one, I don't really want to have to go ahead and make a new user ahead of time, right, and pass it in. It'd be a lot better if I could just call create admin user and automatically get back an admin user. Where this starts to become really relevant is if you are writing code that is intended to be used in say a library or something like that. If you are writing a library, you wouldn't want to have to tell your users, people on GitHub to say, oh yeah, first you got to make a user and then you got to pass it off to this method. No, they won't buy that. They want to just have a single method that they can call that will return a user or an admin user. So we might solve this by moving this entire statement inside of here that will create a new user while generating a unique ID for them into our default function arguments here. So now whenever I call create admin user, I can call it just by itself and I get back a random user, as we see over here, and they are admin true. I could also, if I already had a user on hand, let's say that I've got a new user already, like so, I could just pass in the user as well. And so now I'm not creating a new user and promoting them. I would be taking my existing user and creating an admin out of them. And so by using default function arguments here, I've turned this create admin user function into something much more flexible that can be used in either situation. Either situation where I want to create a new user from scratch, and also in the situation where I want to take an existing user and turn them into an admin. So whenever you're kind of looking down this kind of situation right here, I really recommend you check out default function arguments. All right, so with a better idea of how this works, let's continue in the next section and get some practice on some exercises.